Paul said something shocking to me right after we got home from my mother's funeral. "I'll handle the inheritance for you. Be grateful. If you don't like it, let's get divorced." I was stunned, left speechless by his words. On the desk in front of me were 3 documents, and seeing them, I made up my mind to divorce him. Paul expected an immediate response, but when I calmly told him my decision, he looked confused. He clearly thought I would agree to his terms without question. Ignoring his reaction, I packed my things and left the house, determined to start the next chapter of my life and carry out my plan. My name is Laura Bush, and I'm 31 years old. My husband, Paul, is 36 and works at a bank. We've been married for 6 years, and during that time, I've supported him as a homemaker. Those 6 years, however, have been anything but happy. Paul works at a regional bank that struggles financially. He's not passionate about his job and does just enough to meet his quotas, which has left him isolated at work. Once, after picking him up from a work party where he was drunk, I overheard him bragging to a junior colleague. "Why work hard? Doing the bare minimum and getting a decent paycheck is enough." Knowing his attitude at work, I wanted to say, "You're the last person who should be giving advice." Paul has always been lazy and looks down on people who put in effort. He constantly thinks about how to get through the day with as little work as possible. He mocks people who strive for promotions and has no drive or ambition. His colleagues and juniors don't respect him, and he often complains about how he's treated at work. I'm a freelance painter, and Paul used to admire my work when we were dating. But after we got married and he learned how much I earn, his attitude changed completely. "Being a painter with that income? Your skills are much different from someone who paints as a hobby, haha," he'd say. His supportive words turned into cruel remarks. On days when things didn't go well at his job, he'd take his frustration out on me, making me feel worthless. "You're lucky you can paint alone. No one bothers you. Meanwhile, I deal with constant complaints at work. Why don't you find a better paying jobs?" His repeated criticisms made me question everything. I thought about giving up my work as a painter many times, but I kept going because of the people who loved and bought my paintings. Women would happily tell me, my husband loved the painting I gave him for his birthday, and couples often purchased my work to create lasting memories for their children. Encouraged by these kind customers, I managed to keep painting every month, despite Paul's constant criticism. My workspace was in the living room, a bright and peaceful place. When I opened the windows, fresh air filled the room, making it the perfect environment for my work. My mother had bought this house for me so I could focus on my art. The living room was my favorite spot, with its calm atmosphere and beautiful view from the window. Often, just looking outside gave me fresh ideas for my paintings. But Paul started coming into the living room more often, even though I'd told him it was my workspace. "Hey, I'm working here," I reminded him. "I know it's your day off, but I've asked you not to come in when I'm painting. I can't concentrate." Still, he would barge in, and most of the time, it wasn't for anything important. He would vent about his job or make sarcastic comments. It made it hard for me to focus, so I asked him to go to another room. Instead of respecting my request, Paul responded with a mocking look. "Who do you think you're talking to? I can rest wherever I want. I'm the one supporting you." He always spoke to me as if he was above me because his income was higher than mine. This behavior started after I opened a joint account at his request. Once he saw my income and savings, his attitude completely changed from how he was before we got married. "I thought you could afford a better lifestyle," he said one day. "It's hard to believe you're the daughter of a woman who runs a company. Your mom must be disappointed to have such a poor daughter. She probably wanted to leave the company to you, but realized you couldn't handle it, so she passed it to someone else." I couldn't help but feel anger and hatred toward him. He looked down on me because I earned less and constantly insulted me. Yet, thanks to his salary, I was able to continue my painting without financial worries. Even so, I began to think seriously about inheriting my mother's company after discussing it with her. I decided not to take over my mother's company. She told me, "You don't need to spend your life trying to meet your parents' expectations. I'm happy if you follow your dreams. If you're happy, that's enough for me. Your dream is my dream too." Encouraged by her kind words, I chose to pursue my passion for painting. However, Paul never understood my mother's perspective. Whenever we talked about it, it would turn into a tiring argument. Eventually, I realized it wasn't worth the effort, so I stopped arguing with him. Instead, I pretended to listen while letting him say whatever he wanted. Over the 6 years of our marriage, I learned that by half listening and not engaging, I could avoid building up frustration. When Paul noticed I wasn't paying attention, he would click his tongue, stop talking, and leave the room. Since he wasn't physically violent, I convinced myself to keep ignoring his behavior as a way to manage. But everything changed after a life-shifting event. My mother, who had been living in a care facility, passed away. She had been a well-known CEO of a top-rated car manufacturing company in the USA. During her leadership, the company employed over 8,000 people and earned a stellar reputation. When I was 29, she decided to retire and, thinking about the future, had planned to pass the company to me. But she respected my dream of becoming a painter and entrusted the company to her closest friend, Kate Winslet. Kate and I had been friends since childhood, almost like family. We lived close to each other, and my mother trusted her deeply. However, Paul had no idea Kate was my best friend or that she lived nearby. This was because Kate had specifically asked me not to tell him. "There's no need to bring up old school connections," she said. One day, Kate approached me with concern. "I've been hearing about your situation with Paul, and I'm worried about you." "I thought it was time we talked," she said. Back in high school, Paul and Kate attended the same school but were in different classes. They only knew each other by name. Paul had gained a reputation for his bad behavior, which made Kate uneasy about him even now. Her concerns left me thinking deeply about my life and my choices. "I was never in the same class as Paul, so I only heard things about him," Kate said. "But from what I heard, he often argued with teachers in class. The kids in his class used to say lessons could hardly continue because of him." Kate always made sure to visit me when Paul wasn't home to avoid meeting him. She had attended our wedding, but since she changed her last name after marriage, Paul didn't realize she was the same person he knew from high school. To this day, Paul has no idea that Kate is my best friend. He shows little interest in my personal life, so even though I've told him I have close friends, he's never been curious enough to ask more. "I don't need you to report everything to me," he once said, so I never brought Kate up again. "In high school, I also heard bad rumors about him when it came to money," Kate continued. "It seemed like he borrowed money from friends often and rarely paid it back. That's one of the reasons I was worried about you. But when I heard he works at a bank and seems to be taking care of living expenses, I felt a little better. Still, I don't know how he would react if he found out I'm the president of your mother's company, so please don't tell him anything about me." Seeing Kate apologize with a nervous smile made me feel guilty too. The Paul the first dated had seemed so different from the person Kate described. To me, he appeared responsible, kind, and someone my parents would have approved of. That was my impression when I first met him. I met Paul for the first time at an art exhibition where my paintings were displayed. At that time, I was struggling and unsure about my future as a painter. I even questioned whether I should quit. During that difficult period, I had created a piece that was deeply personal to me. At the exhibition, most people walked past it without stopping. But Paul stood in front of that painting for hours. "Do you like this painting?" I asked him, overwhelmed with happiness. I couldn't help but speak to him after seeing how long he had been staring at it. "I don't know much about art," he admitted, "but for some reason, this painting really caught my attention." I didn't even realize how much time had passed. His words surprised me. Paul wasn't an art expert, but his genuine interest in my work touched me. It felt like he understood the emotions I had poured into that painting, and at that moment, I thought he might be someone special. "The person I came with already went home," Paul said, still standing in front of the painting. "I've been thinking about what the artist felt while creating this." Before I knew it, hours had passed. When I look at this painting, I feel a strange sense of connection. I've never been interested in art before, but this is the first time something has made me feel this way. It's surprising. As Paul laughed and scratched his head, I couldn't help but feel charmed. Hearing those words from someone who knew nothing about art lifted the cloud of doubt I had been carrying. Knowing that someone could connect with the feelings I poured into my work brought me immense joy. Moved by his reaction, I told him, almost shyly, that this was my painting. That moment marked the beginning of our connection. We exchanged contact information, and although Paul wasn't particularly into art, he began attending every one of my exhibitions. "I'd love to see you paint sometime." "Where do you work?" he asked one day. His interest in me and my work delighted me, and I found myself wanting to know more about him too. I invited him to my home, and soon after, he asked me out. "I want to always be by your side when you're happily painting," he said. It was the first time anyone had confessed their feelings to me like that, and I felt overwhelmed with happiness. I accepted his confession, and that was how our relationship began. I was certain that a bright and happy future awaited us. When I told my parents about Paul, they were thrilled. My mother even shared the news with her friends. "I never thought this day would come for Laura," she said. "She's always been so focused on her paintings that I was worried she didn't care about men at all." Really, after I became ill, my biggest concern was her future. Now all that's left is to see her in a bridal gown. At the time, my father had been diagnosed with cancer. He was in the hospital and undergoing painful treatments, but his determination to see me get married gave him strength. Thanks to his resolve, we were able to walk down the aisle together. It felt like he had no regrets left, and just a few days after the wedding, my father passed away. Afterward, my mother's health began to decline. She was heartbroken by the loss of my father and had to be admitted to a care facility. Although there was nothing physically wrong with her brain, her grief was so deep that she never regained her former strength and energy. When I turned 32, she passed away. Her final words were spoken with a peaceful smile. "Your father has finally come to take me with him." I struggled to come to terms with my mother's death, so much so that I couldn't even bring myself to paint. Meanwhile, Paul seemed to be in a cheerful mood every day, drinking alcohol and acting carefree. Finally, I can relax. "You'll get the inheritance, right? It was worth being patient. Now I'm free," he said one evening, clearly drunk. His words were so shocking that I hoped I had misheard him. "You're drinking too much." "What did you just say?" I asked, unable to hide my disbelief. At the funeral, he had been drinking unnecessarily as well, so part of me tried to dismiss it as a drunk joke. But what he said felt too significant to ignore. When I pressed him for an answer, Paul laughed in a way that made my stomach churn. "I've always been nice to your parents to get the inheritance. Pretending to be kind was tough. So what does their will say? Show it to me?" His insensitive words and mocking laugh made my blood boil. How could he act this way when I was grieving the loss of my parents? "Stop it. Don't talk about money right now." "It's incredibly disrespectful," I snapped. Normally, I rarely got angry at Paul, but this time I couldn't hold it in. He had never truly supported me in my grief. Instead, he was focused on their inheritance, and it infuriated me. Hearing Paul's selfish and money-driven words reminded me of the things Kate had told me about his high school days. She had mentioned bad rumors about his dealings with money, like borrowing from friends and never paying it back. I realized that what she said wasn't just a rumor. It was the truth. At that moment, my feelings for him began to fade rapidly. "What's wrong with you all of a sudden? You're making even the good wine taste bad," Paul said, completely ignoring how inappropriate his behavior was. His dismissive words only added to my anger. I had been telling myself for years not to pay attention to his sarcastic remarks, believing he cared about my parents. But now I wondered if everything, his interest in my paintings, our relationship, even our marriage, had all been an act to get his hands on the inheritance. The next morning, Paul shocked me even more. I walked into the living room and saw him awake earlier than usual, sitting on the couch. He was completely sober and looked serious, which was unusual. Surprised, I stared at him as he motioned for me to sit down across from him. "We need to talk," he said, his tone calm but firm. I sat on the couch as Paul had asked, watching him closely to see what he wanted. Suddenly, he placed a divorce paper and another document that looked like a pledge on the table. He then started a conversation I could hardly believe. "I've sobered up and want to talk seriously about our future." "Have you checked your mother's will?" he asked. I was stunned that he brought up the inheritance again, just a day after his awful comments. Had none of my words from yesterday gotten through to him? I still couldn't tell if what he said before was a drunken joke or if he meant every word. Either way, it was unforgivable. He had disrespected my parents, and I would never excuse it. I told you yesterday not to talk about money, I said, my voice filled with anger. My mother just passed away, and you don't think it's insensitive? Even if you were drunk, how could you say those things about my parents? Keep your voice down, Paul said, showing no sign of remorse. Was it so bad to pretend to like your parents? It had to be done. Had to be done? What does that even mean? I asked, furious at his ridiculous excuses. When I pressed him further about his behavior the previous day, Paul only became more defiant. What's wrong with what I said? He asked, as if he truly didn't understand. His lack of sincerity and his dismissive attitude made it clear he didn't care about my feelings. The conversation was going nowhere, so I tried changing the subject. I haven't checked the will yet, I said. There's so much to do. I haven't even started going through my mother's belongings. Why can you only think about money right now? Paul ignored my question and pushed the document toward me. Anyway, I need you to look at this pledge and sign it. Confused, I picked up the paper and started reading. My heart sank as I realized what it said. The pledge stated that I would hand over all decisions regarding the inheritance to Paul and would not interfere. If I broke this agreement, it would result in divorce. I was speechless. The contents of the document were shocking. Paul leaned back, completely unfazed. It's simple. I'm telling you I'll handle the inheritance for you. Be grateful. If you don't like it, we can get divorced. We're married, so the inheritance you receive is basically mine anyway. I'll do what I want with it. Hearing those words, something inside me snapped. I felt a cold, unshakable resolve take over. Understood, I said quietly, keeping my face down. I did not sign the pledge. Instead, I made up my mind to take a different path. I stood up, walked to my room, and began packing my things to leave immediately. Where are you going? Aren't you going to sign the pledge? If not, it's divorce, you know. Don't ignore me, Paul shouted. I know we're getting a divorce, I said firmly. That's why I can't stay here anymore. I'm getting ready to leave. What are you talking about? He asked, completely stunned. Clearly, he thought I would quietly sign the pledge without arguing. His shocked expression almost made me laugh. Do you even understand what you're saying? Are you seriously talking about divorce? You're joking, right? He asked, trying to make sense of it. This is no joke. You're the one who brought it up, remember? Now I'm preparing to leave, so please get out of my way, I said coldly. Years of pent-up anger surged inside me. Learning Paul's true nature during his drunken confession was bad enough, but the pledge was the final blow. After everything, there was no reason to stay in this marriage. As I packed my bags, Paul tried to stop me, panicking, but I ignored him. He seemed too overwhelmed to think clearly. I secretly took the divorce papers, determined to leave the home I had lived in for the past 6 years. As I walked out, I said, "Thank you for everything up until now." Hey, wait. Paul called after me, but I didn't stop. I got into a car I had arranged in advance and headed straight to my parents' house. Later, I decided to execute the next step of my plan. The following day, I visited the bank where Paul worked. As soon as I arrived, people seemed surprised to see me. "You're Mrs. Bush, right?" an employee asked. "Paul is on leave to handle estate matters." I apologized for the sudden visit. "I need to speak with the branch manager." "Is he available?" I replied politely. Soon, I was led to the branch manager's office. He greeted me with a smile. "Hello, Mrs. Bush. It's been a while. What brings you here today?" I smiled back briefly. I apologize for showing up unannounced. Also, I'm no longer Mrs. Bush. Paul and I are already divorced, and I need to discuss something important with you. The news of our divorce caused a stir among the bank staff. Ignoring the whispers around me, I calmly continued. "I'd like to close all my accounts," I said. "That includes both my high-value and regular savings accounts. This will likely be my last visit to this branch," I said calmly. The branch manager looked confused. "What do you mean?" he asked, clearly not expecting such a statement. Nearby employees overhearing the conversation, must have sensed something serious. It wasn't long before someone contacted Paul. Paul arrived at the bank out of breath, his clothes wrinkled and hair messy. "Wait. What are you doing?" he called out as he rushed in. "Paul, please come this way." "And Miss—" "Oh, sorry, Miss Hillary. This way as well," the branch manager said, stumbling over how to address me after the sudden declaration of divorce. He quickly composed himself and led both of us to a private meeting room. The staff exchanged curious glances, whispering to each other about Paul's situation. Ignoring their stares, I followed the branch manager with dignity, not sparing Paul a single glance. Once we were seated in the meeting room, the branch manager addressed me directly. "About your request to close all your accounts earlier, could you tell me the reason?" "As I mentioned, I've divorced Paul. I won't be needing the bank services anymore, so I'd like to close all my accounts," I replied. "Close the accounts?
What are you talking about?"
Paul blurted, his voice rising as I had expected. It was obvious he had no idea what was happening since I had spoken directly to the branch manager. His panicked reaction made me sigh. The branch manager stepped in to explain calmly. "Ms. Hillary has informed me about your divorce and requested to close all her accounts here. Were you not aware of this?" Paul looked flustered, his voice defensive. "I had no idea about the account closures. As for the divorce, we were still discussing it. I never agreed to it." Hearing this, I couldn't help but laugh before I could stop myself. Paul glared at me, his expression demanding to know what was so funny. "You might not have agreed to the divorce," I said, meeting his glare, "but I've already filed the papers." "You filed the divorce papers?" Paul repeated, stunned. He hadn't realized I had taken the papers to the court. When he heard they had been officially filed, he let out a loud groan. The branch manager looked at me, clearly trying to process the situation. "Yes, Paul," I said coolly. "You're the one who gave me those papers. I told you I wouldn't sign that ridiculous pledge, so I took care of it. This was all your idea." Paul sat there, speechless, as I continued. "We are officially divorced. There's no need to discuss splitting property. The house is in my name since my mother bought it for me. I'm giving you 4 days to collect your belongings and move out. If you don't, I'll involve the police." "But the divorce papers were just meant to get you to sign the pledge," Paul protested, his voice desperate. "Too late for that," I replied. "This is over, Paul. Accept it. I never meant for the divorce to actually happen. Why did you take the papers to the office? Don't you think that's going too far?" "And the pledge?" Paul trailed off. The branch manager, who had been silently observing our exchange, seemed to realize the situation was far messier than he had anticipated. He wisely kept his distance, but perked up at the mention of the pledge. Unable to ignore it, he finally spoke. "What pledge?" the branch manager asked, directing his question at Paul, who suddenly looked cornered. Paul hesitated, clearly unable to provide a solid explanation. While he may not have been the most capable employee, he likely relied on maintaining good relationships at work. If the details of the pledge came out, it could ruin his reputation and destroy the trust he had built within the company. In the worst case, it might even cost him his job. Seeing Paul squirm, I decided to take charge and explain the situation confidently. "My mother recently passed away," I began. "Paul gave me a pledge stating he would take full control of the inheritance. If I didn't agree, he threatened me with divorce. I couldn't accept those terms, so I filed for divorce instead."
"What?"
"No, that's not true," Paul stammered, his voice desperate as he tried to defend himself. "It was just a drunken joke. I wasn't serious. I would never do something like that." Paul's excuses only made things worse. The branch manager's expression grew colder, and the staff nearby exchanged disapproving glances. Paul's behavior had clearly crossed a line, and no one seemed inclined to side with him. Feeling the pressure of the manager's critical gaze, Paul fumbled for a way to salvage his pride, but he was no match for the truth I was telling. "A joke," I said, my voice dripping with mockery. "You're telling me you signed the divorce papers as a joke? And what about when you admitted you only pretended to be nice to my parents to get their inheritance? Are you going to call that a joke too?" I smiled at him, knowing his words would only dig his hole deeper. The branch manager turned his gaze toward Paul, his disapproval clear. Paul's face turned pale, and he looked completely bewildered. His desperation to maintain his pride was obvious, but I had no intention of letting him off the hook. Now, I said, turning back to the branch manager, please proceed with closing both my regular savings account and the account holding $400 million. At the mention of $400 million, Paul froze. He had likely assumed I was only closing my standard account, which wouldn't have affected him much. But this was different. $400 million? Paul spluttered. Where did that kind of money come from? There's no way your paintings alone could earn that much. It's not from painting, I said simply. Painting isn't my only job.
What?
I've never heard about any other job, Paul said, his confusion growing as he stared at me. Watching his bewildered expression, I felt a sense of satisfaction. The life he thought he controlled was slipping through his fingers, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. I sighed, pulled a business card from my bag, and handed it to Paul. This is my real job. Painting is just one of my hobbies. Paul looked at the card, and his face went pale. This company, isn't this the old hag's company? Wait, you're the CEO? Since when? He blurted, accidentally insulting my mother. Realizing his mistake, he quickly covered his mouth, glancing nervously at the branch manager, but it was too late. The manager gave him a sharp, disapproving look. What do you mean?
I thought Kate was supposed to be the CEO.
What's going on? Paul stammered. Kate, huh? I replied, raising an eyebrow. You seemed so uninterested in my mother's company. So, how do you know Kate is the CEO? Strange, isn't it? You weren't supposed to know. Paul's eyes widened as he realized he had slipped up. He tried to recover, but his forehead was already damp with sweat. I decided to lay it all out. Did you really think I didn't know you were pursuing Kate for her money? She's my best friend, Paul. Of course I knew. Kate contacted me recently and told me everything. I pulled out my phone and played a recording Kate had made of a call from Paul. The audio captured Paul trying to persuade Kate to meet him, even suggesting a hotel. The branch manager's eyes widened in shock, and Paul turned ghostly pale, unable to say a word. You never imagined Kate and I were best friends, did you? I continued. If you had actually paid attention to what I said over the years, you might have figured it out. But you were too focused on scheming for money. I paused, then added with a smirk, I knew all along that you only approached me for my family's wealth. That's why I never told you I'd taken over the company. Kate's position as CEO was just a formality. I've been running everything from the start. If you had done your homework properly, you might have known. But your lazy habits backfired on you. Paul sat there, completely speechless, as the weight of the situation sank in. The branch manager, who had been quietly watching the exchange, finally spoke. I'm deeply disappointed in you, Paul. Your behavior toward your wife and her parents is appalling. It also raises serious concerns about your character as an employee. Additionally, losing Ms. Laura's accounts would be a significant blow to this branch. Paul panicked and tried to recover. Branch manager, please.
Give me some time.
I'll definitely try to convince Laura to change her mind. I shook my head. Don't bother. No matter what you say, I'm not going to reconsider. I'm closing my accounts, and that's final. The branch manager turned to me, looking thoughtful. Then, to my surprise, he made an unexpected proposal. If Paul were to leave this branch, would you consider reevaluating your decision to cancel the accounts? Paul's jaw dropped. He hadn't expected the branch manager to suggest removing him. I was taken aback as well, but curious to hear more. I leaned in, showing interest in what the branch manager was saying. We'd prefer to continue managing your accounts, if possible. Honestly, I've had enough of Paul's behavior. Considering this incident and other issues, we are looking into dismissing him. We value our clients' trust more than protecting an employee like him. What do you think? Branch manager, what are you saying? Paul blurted out, panicking. Dismissal? Just like that? I'll sue the company. Hearing this, the branch manager turned to Paul with a calm but firm expression. If you want to sue, go ahead. As the branch manager, I've heard plenty of complaints from employees about your conduct. If it comes to that, I'll report everything to the company and we'll hire lawyers to address your misdeeds in court. Realizing he had no way out, Paul fell silent. His face drained of color as he finally understood the gravity of the situation. Overwhelmed, he sank to the floor, muttering, "How did it come to this? Why me?" I watched him with cold indifference. "You've always used people as tools to get what you want, Paul. This is the result of your own actions. If you have regrets, maybe it's time you reflect on your character." With that, the curtain fell on my revenge against Paul. After the incident, Paul was fired from the bank and, as promised, left my house. He begged me to reconsider the divorce until the very end, but when I pretended to call the police, he gave up and returned to his parents' home. I had already explained everything to his parents, and they disowned him after learning the truth. Of course, that wasn't the end of the matter. I had consulted a lawyer about Paul's behavior and had quietly collected evidence over time. Using this, I filed a case demanding compensation. His repeated attempts to take Kate to hotels and his inappropriate behavior further strengthened my case for damages. Paul, who once schemed to get my mother's inheritance, had poor financial habits and had already squandered his savings. Now he lives in a small, rundown apartment, working long hours to pay off his debts. Meanwhile, I've regained my peace. My life is back on track, and my work is thriving. Every day feels brighter and more fulfilling. "Laura, you finally have your smile back," Kate said one day. "You seem happier than ever, and your paintings are full of bright colors now." "Really?" I replied with a grin. "Maybe it's because I have a strong ally like you, Kate. Lately, I've been brimming with ideas, and my painting is going better than ever." I felt like my paintings had gotten even better. One day, a customer who was an antique dealer showed great interest in my work. Because of this, orders for my paintings started to increase, and I eventually held my own exhibition. At the same time, thanks to Kate's hard work, the company has grown steadily. It is now a globally recognized top-class car manufacturer. I make time to support Kate in her efforts, and together, we continue to protect the company my mother left behind.